Hey guys, welcome to our first health psych lecture. So like the first chapter, I feel in most textbooks, most classes, today we're going to be really introducing the topic of health psychology, as well as talking about the history of the subject and where the field and the state of health exists today. So let's start off with some basics. In this class, and I would encourage you in general to kind of adopt this definition as well, that our definition of health is going to be a state of complete physical, psychological, and social well-being. So we're not simply focusing on the absence of disease in this class, but a more holistic, well-rounded sense of well-being across those three spheres. As far as health psychology itself goes, it is a field that specializes in the interrelationship between physical health and mental health. So how, for example, having a diagnosis of cardiovascular disease could impact how a person feels, potentially setting them up for depression. But also on the flip side, how having depression in the first place and inflammatory mental health diagnosis could potentially set you up for heart disease later. So it's a bidirectional relationship in which physical health can trigger mental health and vice versa. So clinical psychologists themselves can really kind of work, I guess, in two spheres. One would be the more research kind of academic sphere. And if that is the area that the health psychologist is interested in working in, then they would simply need an education in health psychology, whether that be a master's degree or a doctoral program. If, however, a health psychologist is hoping to practice, so to do therapy with folks with physical and or mental health conditions, at that point, the provider would have to set themselves up to be licensed and to do those things, which basically means that they would have to pursue either a clinical or a counseling psychology education, taking supplementary coursework in health psychology. And that, the latter of those, is what I do when I'm not teaching. So despite the fact that we're in a really nice place with health right now in terms of this past few decades, we've done a better job as a whole, kind of looking at health from this more holistic perspective. Historically, this hasn't always been the definition that we've utilized. So we're going to spend a little bit of time here going through human history and kind of discussing some changes with respect to health. So different civilizations at different points in time approached, defined, and treated illnesses differently. Starting with kind of prehistoric views, which date back to about 20,000 years ago, good and evil spirits were seen as being the origin of illnesses. And so it makes sense from this point of view that shamans would be our primary clinicians, because we've got really what is understood to be a spiritual or a religious type of pathology. And so we're going to have a spiritual person as the clinician in that scenario. We're also going to have more spiritually based interventions. For example, trephination was an extremely popular surgical treatment in Europe, Egypt, India, Central and South America, and it basically entailed drilling a burr hole into the side of the patient's skull to create an exit point for any evil spirits that may have possessed the person. So fast forward to about 4,000 years ago, Egyptians were tremendously important to our understanding of human health, in that they introduced hygiene as an important kind of factor in whether or not a person gets sick. So that might seem fairly commonsensical given what we understand about hygiene and health, and particularly given the time we live in now, where hygiene has become so important in light of the coronavirus pandemic. But humans didn't always understand hygiene and health to be linked. So ancient Egyptians were the first ones to engage in cleaning rites, and Mesopotamia is the first place that began manufacturing soap. Fast forward to the Greco-Roman era. This is where we saw a lot of innovations with respect to community level or public health and sanitation. And we also saw some predominant figures kind of enter the scene and change the way that we think about health and health-based innovations. So we're going to kind of split Rome and Greece up, focusing first on Rome. And for a date reference, this was about 400 to 500 years BCE. So Rome was the first civilization to build a modern day sewage system, so that people weren't just, relieving themselves anywhere, like in the street, creating an obviously poor hygienic health issue. So so modern day sewage system is important. They were also the first ones to make public bathrooms more commonplace. They were the first ones to utilize an aqueduct to supply citizens with pure drinking water, particularly important given the state of the sewage system prior to all of this. And then they were also the first to create a government agency in charge of health. Specifically, this agency was responsible for clean public roads and regulating perishable foods. So that's Rome. Greece, around the same time, gave us figures more so than public health initiatives. The first of those is Hippocrates, which I'm sure everyone in this class is familiar with. He's considered to be the father of modern medicine because he was the first to launch a scientific study into why people are the way they are and develop a theory explaining why people are different from one another and why some get sick and why some do not. His theory is called the humoral theory. And in a nutshell, Hippocrates believed that all humans consisted of 4 humors or 4 fluids, and that the relative concentrations of these different fluids in our bodies is not just what gave us our personalities, but also could be associated with health as well. The 4 fluids that he focused on were phlegm, blood, bile, and black bile. And he believed, again, that different kind of personalities went with each. And interestingly enough, from a linguistic perspective, some of his terminology actually carries over to today, even though we've obviously moved on from that particular theory. So for example, sanguine is both a Latin term for blood. You know, we use that phrase today. If someone were to bleed out, we'd say that they exsanguinated. But sanguine is also an adjective that can be used to describe a person's personality, specifically the personality that Hippocrates associated with a higher concentration of blood, which would be a more kind of extroverted, sociable, outgoing type of personality. On the opposite end of the spectrum from the sanguine type is the black bile or melancholic type. And yes, we do still use the term melancholy to refer to that type of person, which would be someone who's a bit more moody or anxious or sad. Another interesting thing about Hippocrates' humoral theory is that he also believed that illnesses could be cured by diet and lifestyle changes. So he was very much ahead of his time with respect to that finding, since it's really only been since the 70s. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. We'll kind of work our way up, but it really wasn't until the 70s, at least in Western cultures, when we began to think of health more holistically and as a consequence entertain lifestyle changes as an effective way to treat illnesses versus just focusing on the body and things like, you know, medications and surgeries and very biological interventions. So very ahead of his time with that one. Another Greek that I'd like to introduce you to is Galen. Galen was famous for his dissection studies of animals. He was one of the first to kind of really begin thinking about anatomy, although he wasn't allowed to explore human anatomy unless he was at stadiums working with injured gladiators. So he learned a bit about human anatomy through the injuries that he was able to observe and, you know, attempt to treat. But as far as full dissections, he only had access to animals, but he did kind of kick off the anatomy journey with those inquiries. He was also the first to develop a pharmacological system based on Hippocrates' humor. So he came up with this kind of more herb remedy-based treatment system utilizing Hippocrates' humors as a diagnostic method. Moving ahead to the 4th to 14th centuries AD, we are now in the Middle Ages, which if we're focused in more on Europe, this is going to be a time where scientific explanations start to fade away and are replaced with more religious or Christian explanations, given that many scientific endeavors were prohibited during the time because they conflicted with Christianity. So we've kind of got a callback to prehistoric times, and that we're now kind of focusing more on supernatural explanations for health and illness. So illnesses were viewed as God's punishment for evil doing, whereas plagues were viewed as indicators of God's wrath. The Renaissance, though, which would have been about the 13th to the 17th centuries AD, we see a return of scientific inquiry, anatomical study, and medicine as well. And I've got 2 new figures for you here. First up is Vesalius. Vesalius capitalized on the work that Galen had done in Greece several centuries before, now focusing more so on human cadavers because that was something that was accessible to him at the time. But more importantly, he was actually the first one to draw human anatomy for universal study, which is a really amazing thing if you think about it, because up until this point, if you were interested in studying anatomy yourself, you really had to get your own cadaver in order to do that. There was no kind of universal reference point. So he was really visionary and pioneering in that way, and that he was taking the time to draw this stuff out so that others could learn as well. Descartes is also an important figure from this time, and while he introduced so much across the fields of psychology and biology, the piece that we're really going to focus in on is his Cartesian dualism, also referred to as mind-body dualism. So basically what Descartes believed is that the body is separate from the mind. So our physical form is separate and different from our spirit, our soul, our thoughts, our feelings, and that the two didn't interact. So there was no way to influence bodily symptoms simply based on how you were thinking or feeling, or vice versa. So very much in conflict with what we know about health today. And it was his idea of dualism that kind of kicked off this Western bias against the importance of psychological processes in health, because he basically said that they didn't matter and that the mind and the body were separate, or the mind and the brain were separate. And so going forward from that point, we see a real peak in terms of biology's influence, specifically in the fields of medicine and health. We soon see that anatomical theory replaces Hippocrates' humoral theory as more and more people are looking to anatomy. So anatomical theory is basically just saying that human disease is the function of atypicalities, abnormalities with respect to one's anatomy. So this is replacing Hippocrates' theory that said disease was due to imbalances with respect to a person's four humors. Into the 17th and 18th centuries, we see a lot of advancement with respect to technology and medicine, and these advancements give us new theories as well. So we had the first microscope, which of course leads us to cell theory, the idea that disease result when cells either malfunction or die. Pasteurization also gives us germ theory, the idea that diseases may be caused by viruses or bacteria that invade those cells. And so the culmination of all of these advancements and all of these theories is the biomedical model, which is three-pronged in nature, stating that disease is the result of a pathogen, that the mind and the body are separate, and that health is the absence of disease. And so, unsurprisingly, psychology develops independently from biology and the rest of medicine since about the 1900s. And this makes sense because this is really when we start to see clinical psychology advancing on its own as an independent field. So the early 1900s is when Freud came into popularity with his psychoanalysis, his ideas of there being repressed emotions and things in our unconscious mind that exist beneath the surface and outside the realm of our own personal awareness. And this developed over the years into the cognitive behavioral theories that we use today, as well as more fourth wave treatments, which include a lot of the mindfulness-based ones that are becoming more popular these days. So into the 1970s, this is when Eastern medicine and Eastern approaches begin to become more popular in Western circles. I do want to acknowledge that even though I'm listing the 70s as the time when monism replaces dualism, i.e. this idea that the body and the mind are one and that psychology impacts biology and vice versa, even though that idea really only became popular in the 70s in Western spheres, that Eastern countries have been practicing monism in a more holistic perspective for centuries. So traditional Oriental medicine, for instance, has been around since about 1000 BCE, and it's recognized the importance of inner harmony to physical health for thousands of years. So to say that the 70s is when we were introduced to monism is kind of an egocentric view, but again, I'm kind of presenting more of the Western view in the first place. So as psychology rejoined medicine, we saw several new fields, one of which is behavioral medicine. Behavioral medicine is an interdisciplinary field in which various providers come together to acknowledge the biological, but also the psychological and social factors that impact one's health. So a behavioral medicine unit at a hospital, for instance, might look like physicians and nurses and social workers and psychologists and other folks coming together to work holistically towards treatment. And then health psychology would be psychology's specific role under the umbrella of behavioral medicine. So even though we've arrived at this point in our study at a good place as far as the definition of health goes, we're looking at it more holistically. Unfortunately, we still have a huge number of modern health disparities. A health disparity being a circumstance when the benefits of modern medicine and modern perspectives are not universally enjoyed. So a person's access to good health has to do in part to who they are and where they live. So some examples, health disparities exist across countries. So life expectancy varies tremendously just based on where you're born, from about 30 being the low in nations like Haiti to 80 being about the high on average. These are averages in countries like the United States and Canada. And then even within countries like those, like the United States, for instance, where you live within a country that big plays a big role in your health as well. So death rates are going to be higher in the southeastern United States compared to other regions. Race, of course, is an area that highlights a tremendous number of health disparities. Cancer is the example I give here. Cancer incidence is projected to double among people of color in the United States, but many health conditions are frequently more diagnosed in people of color compared to their white counterparts. And even the pandemic, COVID-19 is no exception to that. There are a number of reasons for this, a number of systemic reasons that reference various people's access to health based on where they live. So, I mean, one example being like urban food deserts. So people of color tend to concentrate themselves more so within urban centers, which just by nature of the density of people and lack of access to immediate farmlands and things like that just means that those people are going to have less access to fresh, healthier foods. So that's one example of a systemic factor kind of acting out on people of color. Beyond that, though, there are also provider factors that are important to attend to, provider biases and things of that nature that impact providers, meaning physicians, nurses, et cetera, treating white people versus people of color differently, some of this being conscious, some of this being unconscious, but that various treatment does lead to different health outcomes. And that is going to be more the focus of this NCBI article that I'm going to have you guys read outside of class as well to discuss later in class. From an age perspective, we see various illnesses impacting people differently based on how old they are. So drug and alcohol-related deaths, violence, accidents, and STIs are all going to be more common among teenagers than their older counterparts. And then as far as sex and gender go, men are twice as likely to die of any cause. Women do catch up to them in middle age once they've gone through menopause, suggesting that menopause plays a bit of a protective factor. And at this point, women have higher disease and disability rates, although a piece of that is because men have already been dying twice as frequently as of other causes up to this point. And so there are going to be more women existing into middle age and beyond. So proportionally, it makes sense that they would be occupying a higher number of morbidity and mortality statistics at that point. So the goals of health professionals at this point are, one, to decrease these health disparities to try and make health more universally accessible, and two, to strive for global wellness. So again, not simply the absence of disease, but above and beyond true psychosocial wellness. So how does the United States stack up? You know, if I've kind of posited this idea that health is different in different places, how does the United States measure? Despite our I would say economic, I guess, footing within the world stage. From a health perspective, we are only ranked 11th among wealthy nations, which is a bit low. This has to do mainly with the fact that our healthcare system is extremely expensive and complex, specifically the most expensive and the most complex compared to other nations. One of the reasons for this is that rather than operating one simple healthcare model, we operate all four of the big ones. So there's almost kind of this caste-like system where based on what you do or who you are, you have different access to health. The fact that we're running four models also is more expensive and more complicated than just running one. Beyond that, we have various healthcare agencies. We've got the FDA, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Centers for Disease Control and Protection, the Veterans Administration. We've got a number of big agencies that have an impact on health versus just one, so that's more complicated. complicated. We've also got complicated jargon like premiums, deductibles, that's not really intuitive. That's not something that people are really formally taught. They kind of have to figure it out for themselves. We have multiple payer systems too, meaning that health insurance pays for some, we as citizens pay for some, employers pay for some, the government pays for some. It's just very, very complicated. So let's talk about these 4 different health insurance systems to understand what they look like in a pure sense, and then also what they look like here in the United States. So up first, we have the Beveridge model, and this one originated in Great Britain, although it is used in other countries today as well. This one is where healthcare is funded publicly by the government through taxes, in the same way that like the police, the fire department, public libraries are all funded through taxes as well. And that citizens will receive health services at public hospitals as well. So we've got government funding and then services being provided by government employees, basically. So here in the United States, if you are a veteran, you are living within the Beveridge model, because vets' healthcare benefits are provided through taxes. But then if a veteran wants to use those benefits, they can't just go anywhere. They can't just go to Watauga Medical or Baptist down in Wake Forest or UNC or Duke. They've got to go to the VA. So we've got public funding through a specific public hospital setup. Next up is the Bismarck model, and this one originated in Germany. This is really the opposite of Beveridge. So this is a private system in which employees and employers contribute to sickness funds every month that an employee can then use if they become ill. So this is a private system. So we're not talking about the government. We're talking about an arrangement that's worked out privately between employees and employers. And for us in the United States, a working American with access to benefits is someone who's going to be utilizing this Bismarck model. So this is about 50% of our population currently. So this, for instance, is the one that I'm in, the one that most of you will end up being in once you graduate and kind of move on to full-time employment. Is, a part of my paycheck each month goes to my health insurance, and then app also kicks in for my health insurance. And that's the same for everybody at app. In fact, everyone at all of the UNC schools, plus all K-12 educators, are in this sickness fund. And it's not my money, it's everybody's money once the money is in the fund. And then if I were to become sick or someone else were to become sick, I can kind of draw on that resource to help me pay my expenses. The national health insurance model is Canada's model. They're probably the country that's most commonly associated with this approach. This is kind of a Beveridge Bismarck hybrid. I would say it's closest to Beveridge in that we've got that public funding. So we're still paying for health insurance for all through our taxes, but rather than requiring people to go to government hospitals like the VA, people may go to any private hospital. So you could go to any, again, to just use local examples, Watauga Medical, Wake Forest Baptist, UNC, Duke, et cetera, et cetera. So in this way, we've got that Beveridge funding, but that Bismarck access, I guess, to private hospitals. So today, about 35% of our population has access to NHI, and that would be older adults who are utilizing Medicare and those below the federal poverty line who are utilizing Medicaid. That's about 15 and 20% of the population, respectively. So again, Medicare and Medicaid are benefits that are provided for through taxes, but again, then those people can go to a variety of private institutions to receive care. Finally, we've got the out-of-pocket model. So this is the model that we see existing in developing countries. In fact, about 80% of countries have this model. That's about 160 out of the 200 countries we have on this planet. And this is basically where there is no system. Citizens simply pay out of pocket for the entirety of their medical bill. And in the United States, this is how the uninsured are treated, which is about 10% of the population. So you'll note that those below the federal poverty line have access to Medicaid. But if we're talking about the uninsured population, we're actually talking about a group of people who are above the federal poverty line, but just don't have access to health insurance in another way. So let's talk a bit more about this particular group. Who are they? First of all, they're working families. So you guys can see by this graphic that about 73% of the uninsured are families in which there's at least one full-time worker within the home. So we're dealing with working families. They are also families in the low to mid income range. So what this graph is depicting is the percentage of the uninsured falling at various, I guess, income points, referencing the federal poverty level. So the federal poverty level depends on how many people live within a household. We're just going to use a standard nuclear family of 4 as a reference point here, which would be about $24,250 each year earned between that family of 4. So from an uninsured perspective, only about a quarter of the uninsured exist below the federal poverty line. And at that point, they would have access to Medicaid if they chose to kind of seek out that service. But pretty much everybody else, about 3/4 of the uninsured, are at the federal poverty line or higher. Some are even making 4 times the federal poverty level amount, but are still uninsured. One of the reasons for that, because if you think about that 400 number, that would really mean that we're talking about families that are making about $100,000 a year, which would likely be about $50,000 to each of the heads of household, assuming that the other 2 members of the home are children. So we're not talking about a small amount of money. We're not talking about a huge amount of money, but we're not talking about a small amount of money either. And still we are seeing people in this income bracket who are not insured. Some of the reason for this has to do with the shift in some cases away from providing employees with benefits. More and more companies are kind of shifting in that direction where they're hiring employees as contract workers and they're paying them, but then there's no real access to benefits because that makes it cheaper for the company to operate in that way. And so as a consequence, we are seeing more and more people working, but not getting access to benefits, even though that's something that we used to see more and more decades ago. So most of the uninsured are not below the poverty level. They're actually a little bit above. And then from a racial perspective, the vast majority are also people of color. So yes, you're seeing white people taking up about 45% of the uninsured. That's definitely the greatest slice of pie, I guess, on this chart. But collectively, all other races are making up 55%. So collectively, people of color would be the racial group being impacted most by lack of insurance. Also, 80% of the uninsured are United States citizens, so don't just assume that these are illegal aliens or anything like that. The vast majority of the people kind of taken into consideration here are US citizens who still do not have health insurance. There's also a greater likelihood of a person being uninsured if they live in the south or western region of the United States. How has COVID-19 impacted these numbers? So at the start of the pandemic, about 50%, as I mentioned before, Americans were dependent on their employer for health insurance. And then because of pandemic safety measures to kind of shut down various elements of the economy, we saw the unemployment rate shoot up to about 50% in April of 2020. Thankfully, that has been cut in half currently in January 2021, so we're down to about 7%. But about 40% or 2/5 of people reported in a Commonwealth Fund survey that they or their spouse/partner lost a job or were furloughed and had health insurance through that affected job. So 40% of the people who lost their job through the pandemic were relying on that job for access to health insurance. Fortunately, a good number of those people were furloughed, simply meaning that your employers basically told you that you cannot work right now, but you're not fired. But when you can work again, you will work. So it's not quite like losing your job. You're technically still employed. You're simply just not working. And so these people would still get access to their health care, but they're still not kind of pulling in a paycheck. 20% of the people who lost their insurance as a consequence of unemployment were self-employed. And then we saw, unsurprisingly, people of color also being impacted, more specifically Hispanic populations, and those making less than $50,000 a year were impacted more by unemployment and lack of insurance relating to the pandemic. And so at the end of the day, about 20% of those who lost their jobs via the pandemic have now lost access to health insurance. So now we're dealing with more than 10% of the population in this particular scenario. So what are some legislative changes that are impacting our access to healthcare? Currently, we don't really have any legislative changes that have arisen as a consequence of the pandemic. And so I'm going to focus more so on kind of our existing legislative changes that existed kind of up until the pandemic and that still kind of exist. And specifically, I'm going to kind of divide these legislative changes into Obama and Trump. So we're going to talk about this according to the administration. So of course, we're going to talk about Obamacare as far as he goes, sometimes referred to as the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Not everybody knows that the Affordable Care Act is the same thing as Obamacare, but they're the same. One is just kind of a nickname. And so the aim of this was to decrease the percentage of the uninsured. It was successful in doing this, decreasing the percentage of uninsured from 15% of the population to 10. It did this by mandating health insurance, basically, and providing cheaper alternatives for people who weren't receiving health insurance through their employer. Another big Obamacare initiative was that health insurance companies cannot refuse a person coverage based on a pre-existing condition. So prior to this, if a person was particularly unhealthy or had other pre-existing conditions, a health insurance provider could either charge that person a lot of money for health insurance or simply deny them health insurance. So this is important because sometimes pre-existing conditions happen. They're not always the patient's fault. For instance, we don't really know how COVID-19 is going to impact people in the long term, given that it's a respiratory disease. And so many of the people now that got COVID and survived may now have a pre-existing condition as a consequence of that respiratory disease. And so it's important that those people aren't being denied access to healthcare as a consequence of that. Another thing that Obamacare did was that it provided preventative care at no cost. So you'll learn about this later on the semester, but one of the cheapest ways to cut healthcare costs and also keep people healthy is to intervene before they get super sick. So upfront, it might seem like you're wasting money, like you're spending money on a person to get a mammogram when they're not sick. But by doing that ahead of time, you're cutting costs in the long run. You're also keeping people healthy, which is good as well. Okay, so the Trump administration. One thing that Trump did was he eliminated the individual mandate, meaning that he kind of eliminated the individual mandate. The individual mandate was the piece of legislation that said all Americans have to have health insurance. And the penalty for not having health insurance is that there would be a fee at the end of the year when doing your taxes if you couldn't show proof that you were insured over the course of that year. So Trump couldn't really get rid of the individual mandate, but what he did was he lowered the fee to $0. So you do still have to document health insurance at the end of the year, but there's no penalty if you didn't have health insurance. He also expanded access to skinny plans. Skinny's kind of a euphemism for cheap. They're plans that don't cost a lot each month, but then are very expensive if you were going to use them. So a person might pay 20 bucks a month for insurance, but then if they were to get sick, they're going to have to pay 10 grand out of pocket before the insurance company kicks in to help out. So these are just kind of crappy plans. Like, yeah, they're cheap and they're technically insuring more people, but they're also kind of useless plans. And so having a plan is kind of moot unless you get into a serious accident that's extremely expensive. But even then, you're still going to be footing a chunk of the bill. Another good thing I'll say that the Trump administration did was price transparency, and this was in an effort to kind of make healthcare more like the marketplace where you could kind of shop around. So previously, hospitals weren't super transparent about A, what they were charging, or B, what they were charging for. You typically only found this out after the fact, which is kind of insane. It'd be like going to a restaurant and ordering food and then only getting hit with your bill afterwards versus being able to make decisions based on price upfront. And so now hospitals have to tell people ahead of time how much this is going to cost and specifically what they're paying for. So if the person wants to shop around and go somewhere else, they can. So that's more positive change. What can we expect going forward into the future? We're going to see more electronic tech, namely telehealth. Telehealth's been around for a while, but health insurance companies never reimbursed for it. And it was quite frankly viewed as kind of a lesser um, way to, I guess, interact with your provider compared to face-to-face. But I don't see that going away anytime soon. Cat's out of the bag at this point. I don't really see us putting it back in the box, so to speak. Telehealth's great because it boosts patient access to their provider. It also gives them another tool to advocate for themselves. We're going to see more and more Medicare use as boomers retire, and who knows how that program is going to look after that as boomers retire. We're seeing more and more providers emerge from school female, more diverse, more competent, and more business savvy. And so this is kind of having an impact on how business is done and also how patients interact with their providers. Patients are reporting greater satisfaction, seeing themselves represented in who their providers are. And then greater competence and bedside manner is also contributing to fewer malpractice suits. Beyond that, the increased number of providers who are seeking out business classes as well is contributing to more and more providers making the decision to shift over to private practice. And that's contributing to greater job satisfaction among providers as well. Some other things that are changing are that cures, health information, and patient decisions are impacting disease prevalence at greater and greater rates. Some examples are that sexually transmitted infections are up 15% because as people have more access to the plethora of contraceptive options we have today, more people are focusing just on not getting pregnant versus STIs, and condoms are really the only way to prevent an STI. So as more people are using IUDs and implants and things like that, people are kind of trending away from condoms. So that is increasing the rate of STIs. Obesity is also up about 17%. This is due to the Western lifestyle, and obesity rates are also driving the 50% increase in liver cancer and the 20% increase in kidney cancer as well. E. coli is up almost 500% as a consequence of food contamination. Autism is up, not because of vaccines though. I could talk about autism for a while and I'll try to keep this brief and then hop off my soapbox. But in a nutshell, when the first edition of the DSM came out in 1952, autism more closely resembled psychosis or schizophrenia compared to what we know autism to be today. And it wasn't really until 1979, when a newer edition of the DSM came out, that autism got kind of a revamp and started to look more like it looks today. And so if you look at charts showing autism and vaccines on the rise over a period of years, it's because we really started to understand autism better around the time that we started to understand vaccines better and more people started to get vaccinated. Also today, there's less of a stigma around autism. Parents are more willing to bring their children in for assessment and treatment. People are more aware of what the symptoms are. And so we're just better at diagnosing it. It has nothing to do with vaccines. But because parents are opting out of vaccination because of autism and for other reasons, we are seeing things like whooping cough on the rise, which is up about 150%. Another big change that we're seeing is a push towards multidisciplinary healthcare. And this isn't just bringing social workers, psychologists, and mental health professionals to the table. This is bringing like weird people into healthcare, like lawyers. Lawyers can practice healthcare, or farmers can be practicing healthcare by providing healthier food. And so this is a really great video that you should either pause and watch now, or you can come back to later. It's about 10 to 15 minutes and just talks about how healthcare is a really broad term, and surprising people can be working in healthcare, again, like lawyers or farmers. Okay, so the last thing I want to touch on today is a final change that we're seeing in terms of how healthcare looks. And this is kind of tying things back into where we started at the beginning, in that we're shifting towards a holistic perspective of patient health, not just biomedical and the absence of disease. So this means that we're going to be utilizing a biopsychosocial approach to treating folks. We're acknowledging that biology, psychology, and social factors all play a role in a person's health. So as a case example, to kind of flesh this out, we have Elijah, who is a white 22-year-old male who's experienced high levels of anxiety his whole life. He often experiences panic attacks consisting of an elevated heart rate, difficulty breathing, chills, muscle tension, and derealization when he is in enclosed spaces such as elevators, crowds, or the hospital. Elijah's mother and older brother experience a similar problem, although their triggers are different. Elijah has coped over the years by remaining positive and developing a regular exercise routine to help him cope with his symptoms. Socializing and surrounding himself with those who make him feel safe has also been a significant source of ease and decreased tension. So when I do a BPS breakdown, I like to start with the diagnosis and work over towards the symptoms. And then finally, the biological, psychological, and social underlying factors. So these are kind of like causal factors. And the reason I like to work it this way is because students really like to mix up the biology and the psychology with the symptoms. And so I find it's easier to kind of work left to right and eliminate symptoms as we go. So Elijah has acute panic attacks indicated by an elevated heart rate, difficulty breathing, chills, muscle tension, and derealization. What's going on with him biologically is he does have a positive family history, which is impacting him. So this is a negative factor in that he has a positive family history, and so it's actually encouraging the diagnosis of anxiety. Psychologically, he's positive, upbeat, optimistic. He's also exercising regularly, so these are all good things. Socially, he has a strong social network, which is good. He's also white, and white people tend to utilize therapy more frequently than people of color. So those are both working to his advantage. Elijah's also a man, which works for him and against him. It works for him in that anxiety disorders are diagnosed less frequently in men than women. So there's a lesser likelihood that this is going to become truly problematic. A lot of that has to do with the fact that anxiety is an emotion that is socialized in women more so than men. But on the flip side, men are also less likely to seek out help compared to women. So that's why I kind of indicated that as a middle of the road kind of factor. Another thing that's working against him is that some of his triggers are social triggers, like being in a crowd. And so on the one hand, socialization helps, but on the other hand, socialization can also set him up for a panic attack. So what goes into each category? Again, these are underlying causes. So biological mechanisms are going to go into that category, which includes basically anything relating to the physical body. So this would include illnesses and predispositions. So is there family history? Is there a genetic mutation that's setting this person up for diagnosis? Are there any health risk factors like an elevated heart rate or blood pressure rate? Are there any relevant anatomical or physiological findings, like potentially Elijah has a reactive nervous system, and this is one of the things that's causing him to have a problem. Evolution is also something that's important to attend to when thinking about biology, in that certain human behaviors that we see a lot today are because those behaviors evolved over time. And as humans, we are more adapted to the environments of our ancestors than the environments in which we currently live, because evolution is very slow. So for example, one of the reasons that humans crave sugars and fats and high caloric foods today is because those were difficult foods to find many years ago. And if you found one of those foods, it would make sense to binge on that food and overindulge to avoid famine and starvation. Mating behaviors also make sense from an evolutionary point of view. Simply put, if the goal of living is reproduction, a man's going to be more successful at that if he spreads his seed among many partners, and a woman is going to be more successful if she takes the time to pick her mate, because she can really only get pregnant and raise one child, assuming one child per pregnancy, once every 1 to 2 years. Fears are also something that are evolutionary in nature, in that today we see more people being afraid of spiders, snakes, storms, heights than guns, airplanes, cars, highways. So we're very much afraid more often of the things that threatened our ancestors. Age is also a piece of biology, as is biological sex. So it's important to differentiate between sex and gender, because sex is a biological mechanism, gender is a social construct. Sex refers to hormonal differences, chromosomal differences, differences with respect to sex organs, versus gender is how a person is socialized around sex. And this would refer more to what is masculine, what is feminine, what are we taught about sex from our culture. So that's going to be gender. And again, sex is biological. I think psychology is the easiest of the three. It's basically just thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Thoughts would be the kind of the train of thought that's in your head. So, what are you thinking right now? Are you thinking, I can't do this? I'm really tired of online school. Whatever that is that you're thinking, those are your thoughts. Feelings are what you're feeling: sad, angry, happy, scared, lonely, etc. And then behaviors are what you're doing. And this would, in our class in particular, include health behaviors like drug use, eating, exercise, and sleep. So this is an area where students will get concerned sometimes, or confused, as they want to put the behaviors in the bio category. The biological impact of the behavior can go in the bio category, like if a person has lower blood pressure because they're exercising, the low BP can be bio, but the exercise is a behavior, so that's going to be a psych factor. And then finally, socially would be anything having to do with the person's environment or their culture. This includes birth cohort. Birth cohort refers to the systematic effect of the same historical and social conditions being experienced by same aged peers, which basically means that this is a little bit different than age. So we're not just talking about me when I was 20 versus you when you're 20, and we're just talking about age, but we're talking about being the same age as other people at the same point in time. So for instance, Gen Zers, y'all are going through this whole online education thing, and that's not just because of your age, it's because of your age and the point in time we're at. And sometimes birth cohort has the ability to impact health. Like going back to the beginning of the pandemic, for instance, older people were more resistant to masks compared to younger people. And that's not just a consequence of age, but it's kind of an age by historical events kind of interaction. And at the end of the day, that's impacting health because less mask adherence is increasing the risk of getting the virus and getting sick. Race and ethnicity are going to be very social pieces. Um, Biologically, there are no differences between the races. To acknowledge that one person is physically different than another, just based on their race or ethnicity, is more of a racist construct versus kind of a social systemic approach to the topic. And so race and ethnicity are always going to be in the social sphere. And again, we're going to talk more about how providers act as this kind of social force on people of color in this article that we're going to discuss later. SES is important to attend to, and it's comprised of three factors: income, education, and occupation. Gender, as I mentioned before, is an important social factor. It's important to attend to environmental stressors as well, like if something's going on at work or school. It's important to acknowledge whether or not a person has social support. Social support pretty much across the board is a good thing, and a lack of it is a bad thing. It can also be helpful to kind of think of patients utilizing this sociocultural theory that I have an image of on the right side of the screen. Typically, the sociocultural theory is applied more to children and how factors impact them as they grow, but this theory can also be applied to adults as well. Basically, in a nutshell, you think of the patient as being at the center of this series of concentric circles, and as we go out, we're dealing with starting proximally and working more distally various factors that are having an impact on the person. So family and household being closest, friends, neighbors, and cultural groups being a little bit further out, and so on and so forth, until we get to the stage of national and international health initiatives and things like that that can be impacting people. So another look at Elijah, now that you guys know what goes into each category. You could add the evolutionary nature of some of Elijah's fears to the biological category. I already discussed kind of the pros and cons of being a man to Elijah's circumstance. The pro being that men are less likely to be diagnosed with anxiety disorders, the con being that men are less likely to seek out help. You could also potentially include the fact that Elijah is of Gen Z, and typically we're seeing younger generations being more comfortable talking about mental health. There's less stigma, they're more likely to seek out help, and so that could be working to Elijah's advantage as well. All right, so that is all that I have for you guys. So be sure to read that article, and we're going to be working much more with the BPS approach. So make sure that you guys really have that down, and if you have questions, that you bring those to class. All right, I'll see you later.